Hello and welcome to the CNSS Podcast by the Center for National Security Studies at MS Ramaya University of Applied Sciences, Bengaluru. My name is Hamsini and I'm a non-resident fellow here at CNSS. Today I'm speaking to the Honorable Mrs. Janelle Saffin, who is an Australian Member of Parliament. She's a community development specialist, teacher, lawyer, politician, and has worked in government and non government roles and in high level advisory roles. She's an expert on Myanmar with extensive experience and engagement in policy, politics, development, legal, and constitutional matters. Today, Janelle and I are discussing the recent developments in Myanmar and pathways to peace. Listen in. Hi, Janelle. Welcome to the CNSS podcast. We're so happy to have you back here with us.
Oh, thank you, Miss Hamsini. It's great to be back with you. And I've been listening to some of your podcasts and I find them very interesting and informative.
Thank you so much. Today, I wanted to get back to talk a little bit about Myanmar because there's so much that's happened since we last spoke early in the year. And I thought we'd start off with the earthquake that happened on March 28th. And it was devastating in parts of Myanmar, but there was also reports that the military junta was continuing airstrikes, that they were stopping aid from certain areas, even though countries from across the world did send aid for relief efforts. So even now, I think there's discussion about how they declared a ceasefire after the earthquake, and that's going to come to an end at the end of May. So there are questions about the direction that this is going to take going forward. So I think overall, I wanted to just sort of get your thoughts on some of this. How does the politicization of aid work in a situation like this? How do we think about the earthquake and the effects and the ceasefire and what that means for now?
Sure. Look, it's a terrible dilemma for neighbours and other countries and people who want to help, and NGOs, INGOs. And so a real dilemma for them because their instincts are to help. That's what we do. And knowing that quite a bit of the money will find its way into the pockets of Min Aung Hlaing and some cronies, not everyone, but particularly with him. And I've watched how I think he's taken in about around US $24 million in donations, and, we'll never know where that's gone. So that also some of his cronies and the Wa army and the Mongla group, they're helping to fund some of the reconstruction in Naypyidaw in particular. So I'm watching that, and it's a situation, and of course NUG and ethnic nationalities have said, put the aid through us because we can get it to a lot of people on the ground, and I would recommend that. Do the best you can to get it where you can. Some UN agencies also, it's gone in there. But so it was to be expected. So, that's like par for the course for Min Aung Hlaing and others to operate that way, and you just work out the best you can. And some people have been doing it, friend to friend, person to person, family to family, through the sort of second track system. So there's that. And the fact that he would stop aid, though, reaching particular areas, it's just unconscionable. It's cruel. It's cruel. And that is, it just says something about his inability to govern or lead or do anything. And on the ceasefires, I did see that the NUG and some other ethnic nationalities armies that offered ceasefires, so had Min Aung Hlaing, with the SAC and the army, but they didn't last that long, particularly from him, and he has continued to bomb, aerial bombing, and that's continued throughout because he's got fuel. He has less troops on the ground and less troops who want to continue to fight against their own people, but he does get fuel. and he gets arms and fuel, and a lot of fuel, and he seems to be getting that obviously from Russia and China, and that they seem to be the primary sources, but it's that fuel that keeps the airplanes in the air and continues to do that. So some people have called for the sanctions to be on the arms and the fuel, particularly the fuel. I know a lot of people have been calling for that for a long time. And so that's really, and none of this is new. You'd be watching this as well, seeing this play out. And but it's too cruel, again, the aerial bombing, mainly villages where civilians are. And he says, well, there's rebels, as he says there, but really you just, anyone who'll bomb a village that has women and children in, just cannot be recognised as a leader by anyone.
To hold elections in December, but it does, I do feel like there's sort of a rationale to definitely delay the elections at this point. So considering all of these factors and what we're discussing, what are possible pathways to peace talks? How are you thinking about sort of the ways forward in which we can actually go instead of just talking about it, I guess?
I noticed yesterday, I think it was yesterday, the ASEAN put out their statement on, and they call for an extended and expanded ceasefire in Myanmar, and it had 9 points. The NUG also issued one, and they had 8 points, and you've got Min Aung Hlaing with his 5 points. And I think out of all of that, one thing that was really noticeable that should be heeded was the NUG said they stand open and ready to engage with any entity that demonstrates accountability, commitment to people's aspirations of Myanmar, ending the military dictatorship, establishment of federal democratic union, etc., etc. But look, for peace talks to prevail, there has to be an ability to bring people together. And to the extent that I'm watching ASEAN, despite, people criticisms or whatever, they seem to be doing that. I did see that Anwar Ibrahim, as Prime Minister of Malaysia, had met with the NUG Prime Minister, had also met Min Aung Hlaing, but there has to be some, how would I put it, more political will around the mechanism and the ability to bring people together. You don't just say, oh, well, they won't talk, they'll talk conditional on this, they'll talk conditional on that. You go, okay, recognise all those positions of everybody, but what can we do, and start driving really hard. I listen, if it was me, I'd be pulling together people like José Ramos Horta, Nobel Peace Laureate, Timor-Leste, very experienced peacemaker, and Dr. Sarakiart of Thailand, who knows Myanmar well, as does Ramos Horta, some of these elders, and having them utilised to try and, build bridges and do what I call create conditions for peace, because you have to also create conditions. Now, that's incumbent upon the political actors themselves to do that, it's their country. But for those who want to help and support, then I think we need a pathway forward. And if I was in a position again with the UN, I'd be driving that, with the United Nations, and saying that's what we need to do. We need an eminent persons group. We need to focus on not what I call, silly talks, but, really engaging and saying what can happen here. And I would have hoped that happened at BIMSTEC, but I'm not sure that it did. But they're the sort of things I would want. And also, Min Aung Hlaing was at BIMSTEC, and I know people commented about that. I would hope that he would be told if you want to be in these groupings and say you're a leader, then you have to act like a leader and not continue to kill your own people at an alarming rate, women and children. I would hope he was given that message, because tough talk has to happen, as well as, all the diplomatic talk backward and forward.
That's very interesting. And I'm curious. I think you're right. It does involve a certain amount of political will. Um, but these sorts of eminent people, these Nobel Prize winners from Southeast Asia, do you think that their opinions hold sway in Myanmar? Would they be sort of an opening into beginning peace talks? Like how do you see this approach in that sense?
Look, you don't necessarily have to start with people who will hold sway with Min Aung Hlaing. That's a group of cronies, a few armies who fund him. So, you don't have to. Sure, I'm sure Putin holds sway with Min Aung Hlaing. It's just so we don't have to worry about that as much. But respected people who've got skill, who've got some skin in the game, they want for this to prevail, who are engaged and who support and have the will, and then have them resourced somehow to do this. That's what I'd like to see happen. And of course, there are others. I mentioned two names, but I can think of others, and you obviously have to have women there as well. I can think of some who'd be in that eminent persons group and let them work on it. I know ASEAN has a special envoy. People say, and the NUG recommended, people have from day one, they have a special envoy for a year, and they want that not to be rotated, but to be more regular and work in with them. They're the things that need to happen, so that countries issue statements and they're welcome, but then have the next step, which is this engaged, eminent sort of persons group.
No, I think that's a very good way to think about it, because as you mentioned, I think Min Aung Hlaing did visit Russia, and so of course it's very easy for him to sort of establish those relationships with, I guess, like other military cronies. But what I think this is a very realistic way in which we can actually move forward and have some sort of like sustained engagement. Otherwise, as you said, we'd be engaging just in silly talk or rhetoric at all points in time.
Yes, and it demonstrates a will to work in the region with your neighbours, some sort of resourcing. Some countries in the region could throw some resources into it. It doesn't need a lot, but let's start. And into that mix, I'd be inclined to have someone as well, like Cecilio Bangbang Yudhoyono, former general, peacemaker.
And because you worked with the UN, and I'm guessing that this is an approach that the UN has also used in other countries and other regions, how does the process work out in a case like this? If there are an eminent group of people who begin sustained engagement, how would we see it flow through?
Look, it could happen a few ways. It could be through the, offices, the good offices of the UN, and they could draw on countries and say, help resource this, stay engaged with it. The UN is there in country, there's offices there. They have various programs there. That's one way. They have a special envoy, Julie Bishop. And then it could be through the region itself, ASEAN. They could say, well, we'll resource it. There's various ways it could work. It could be the UK, for instance, So there's a long relationship with the UK, and I'm just, thinking out loud, maybe China could be involved, resourcing. Yeah. Why not? They're engaged. China's engaged. Whatever else they say, they're actually engaged.
I think that's fair. I think it's important to sort of like brainstorm ways in which we can actually move forward, considering the state of
Mm,
things, because otherwise we will be
yeah,
stuck in a loop in that sense.
exactly.
Um,
And India's, right next door. It's could be in their interest to be part of it.
yeah, of course.
There's
And, you
eminent
know,
people in India, who've been involved in peacemaking quite a lot.
you're right. And I think all of these stakeholders, China, India, Australia, UK, countries in Southeast Asia, they do also have existing working relationships, I'm guessing, with
Yes,
bureaucrats and people in Myanmar. And so at some point, we have to start sort of going back to those relationships and figuring out ways in which we can engage and move forward.
that's right. Because otherwise it'll be just this long period of continual struggle. And, I know a lot of the democratic forces and ethnic nationality forces are hopeful for, as well, a military, victory, and then they want federal democracy. But that's never certain. Although, there's a lot of ground lost. Myanmar has lost a lot of ground, a lot of soldiers. I think Rakhine, they're barely there. The Arakan army is about 6 miles out of Chao-Pu, the port.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
That's incredibly close. I want to circle back to something that
Mm-hmm.
you'd mentioned about BIMSTEC, about ASEAN, and Min Aung Hlaing attending the BIMSTEC meeting back in
Mm-hmm.
April, March. And so there have been a lot of conversations about him attending the BIMSTEC meeting. And,
Mm-hmm.
even with the ASEAN statement that came out a few days ago, I'm wondering whether all of these sort of point to the idea that neighbors and countries that are interested in engaging with Myanmar, do you think there is more, we're moving towards that sort of situation right now?
Mm-hmm. Look, most countries become tired of conflict on their borders or with their neighbours. And at some point, they just say, it's too hard and we'll continue to engage no matter what. I mean, I've seen that worldwide with many conflicts. And there's not a lot who will just say, okay, we'll stay the distance. And so I see that happening. And again, for some, they'll say, oh, we'll have an election and that's convenient because there'll be some sort of winner and we'll engage with that. I mean, we know an election in Myanmar there's no way anyone could accredit it as free and fair even before it happens. And they're not going to be able to run it, within the whole country. They just can't, not even half the country. But so whether you call it a thaw, I think sometimes, countries just say, well, had enough of that and we'll just get on with our business. They may have other motivations, like also, well, pull them closer and try and talk to them, but it has to go beyond constructive engagement. It has to outline expectations. And often neighbours, countries, those groupings don't always outline expectations. To be a good neighbour, to be able to sit at this table, this is what you have to demonstrate. And that doesn't always happen.
Why is that the case? I'm just curious because I assume that, say, with Thailand, for example, and the
Mm-hmm.
number of people who are going to the Thai border, particularly after the earthquake, has massively
Mm-hmm.
increased. And so, why would countries be hesitant on setting expectations in terms of what the Myanmar, what Myanmar would have to do and sort of meet some of these obligations or expectations?
Look, I'll say ASEAN's certainly done it in its statement yesterday. It's outlined expectations, but when there's meetings behind closed doors, and I know a lot of diplomacy has to happen quietly, but it would be nice to know even, yes, we did discuss, the conflict, what's going on. Yes, we did outline our expectations, we have these. And I think at a broader level, at a foreign affairs level, various countries can outline that, their expectations. They can do it that way. If not from the groupings they're all in, but they can clearly outline it. And we, say this every opportunity we get. So there's ways we can be told without breaching any sort of quiet diplomacy.
Fair enough. I think I want to sort of switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the larger powers. I think one of the things that I heard over the last 2 months were sort of like reports in South Asia about the US backing a logistics network to supply insurgents in Rakhine. And, I've seen reports that staunchly support it and completely rubbish these sorts of claims. But I think the larger question that I have when I was thinking about this is how do we think about external actors? How does Australia think about external actors escalating the conflict, right? And, we've spoken a lot about ASEAN, and I think the statement yesterday and their 5-point consensus as well is very useful. But how do we think about mediation efforts, considering that we're talking about all of this?
Look, firstly, I read those reports too about the Bangladesh-based logistics network and Rakhine. I don't know if they're true or not. And I think you can't really blame outside actors for escalating conflict. It's pretty much Myanmar who's caused the conflict. So that's my first comment. And, that's not my primary concern with supporting Myanmar. And ASEAN could lead the efforts. And again, my observations, my experience, engagement is they need a broader group to do it, and they need this eminent persons group with skills and strategy and, all the things that you do to bring people to a table where you've created conditions, for talks and dialogue and sustain it. So it needs to be more comprehensive because the statement, yes, from ASEAN, fine, statement from NUG and everyone else, fine, but we need that mechanism. And I think if they're going to do mediation, then it has to be within that framework for it to work and not just the one-offs. Sustained strategic engagement.
Sustained strategic
engagement. Yeah.
I think that's valid. I think when we think about both Australia and India's interests with Myanmar, it sounds like the only way forward, to be honest, to have sort of sustained strategic engagement, because how else would we move on this? And, one of the things that I'm also thinking about is Australia recently had its elections, and the statement that India and Australia put out, the joint statement, also emphasized a federal democracy for Myanmar. Considering that democracy is such an important matter, what do we call democracy, and interest for both countries,
yes.
What are practical steps that both Australia and India can take? What are practical steps that we can take to align policies on Myanmar? Whether we're talking about recognition of the NUG, whether we're talking about peace talks going forward, whether we're talking about humanitarian cooperation. What are some of these things that we can do apart from sort of the eminent persons group that we've spoken about?
Well, the statement itself shows an alignment. The fact that that statement was issued by two countries who, you characterise as, their heartbeat is democratic. So they understand it, but they're both federal as well. So they understand federal democracy, albeit differing models, but, Australia and India, both vibrant federal democracies, with their own challenges. So the fact that they issued that statement, I see as a good sign. And they could continue to discuss ways they could support ASEAN, ASEAN within this, the mediation, the strategic, sustained strategic engagement, back in an eminent persons group, they might call it something else. And, there's things that they could do that would really help. And Australia as a regional player engaged very much with ASEAN, with India, with Japan, with China, all of the countries in the region, it's in a good position. to do that. India, clearly, because your neighbours, India's neighbours, Myanmar, a big border, challenges, conflict on the border, all of that. So I see that, increasingly, I think they want to play a role.
Mm. No, that's fair. And I wonder how you also think about the ASEAN's consensus-based approach in that sense, because it has been criticized in the past. And I think, while it makes sense as an approach that it's worked for them on several issues, but I think considering where the ASEAN is right now and considering Myanmar of 2025, how do you see that approach sort of playing out?
Yes, they operate on consensus, but they got consensus early on not to invite men online to attend. They got consensus about, if not a formal engagement, they do engage with the NUG at some level in respective countries. They have since 2021 maintained the 5 points, the consensus agreement. They've maintained that. They haven't resolved from it, despite criticisms, but they've kept it. They've kept a special envoy for Myanmar. So they've managed within that grouping and their consensus to stay focused on Myanmar. They've done it. So I'm not as worried about the consensus. I mean, I go back to when it used to be, I mentioned it earlier, constructive engagement and consensus. And I used to say with consensus, you can get the lowest common denominator. With constructive engagement, you can sort of, tie yourself in knots and not get anywhere. But that it's a more mature ASEAN when those terms were introduced, a bit more of a mature ASEAN today. And they're dealing with it.
That's true. I think as an approach, ASEAN's also trying to figure out all of the ways that they can work within sort of this patchwork of diplomacy. And it's, I think you work in government, you're very familiar how difficult it is to push things through. And with consensus, it's even harder. So
it is. And they're managing.
And they're managing. I agree. I think one of the things that I want to sort of move on is also get your comment on what's happening with sort of Julie Bishop. And there were a lot of reports about how her consultancy had corporatized Chinese organizations, her role as the envoy of the United Nations, but at the same time also a private consultant, and allegations that it undermines credibility in how she's engaging with Myanmar's civil society. So I wanted to also ask you how you think about this, right? Should Australia advocate for an envoy who doesn't have commercial links to the region? How do we think about this?
Okay. First, look, I'll say probably about 3 or 4 things. I've seen a conga line of special envoys, so I think I've known them all since 1990 or whenever after they were appointed. So I've seen them all. And each one comes with a whole range of life experience, interests, engagements, corporate ties, not corporate ties, all of that. That doesn't worry me so much either. I have seen one special envoy who did have business interests in and with Myanmar through, a company a bit at arm's length, but was a very good special envoy and managed to get some things to happen that others didn't. So what I'm saying is most of the people appointed into those roles, we're not sort of picking Mother Teresa to go in as a special envoy every time. They're people who've lived lives and they've got interests. So I'm neither defending or saying, it's great. It's just, to me, it's not the material issue. It's what the envoy actually does and what they can deliver and how they can do that job. To me, that's more important.
That's fair. And do you think I know that Julie Bishop is a UN envoy, but what do you think of her track record in Myanmar? I'm curious.
Okay. She is a UN envoy. She's not, Australia has nothing to do with the appointment. It's just purely from Secretary General, through his offices. So that's how the envoys are chosen. Their nationality is incidental. Look, I don't know yet. It's very difficult for any special envoy. She is more into quiet diplomacy. Some have been more vocal in their diplomacy. She'll have her job cut out for her, though. I know that. In Myanmar, I'm with Min Online,
Fair enough. Don't we all, in that
don't we
sense?
all?
Don't we all? That's to the end of my questions for
Yep.
today. Thank you so much for taking the time out, Janelle.
Oh, thank you.
That's it for this episode of the CNSS podcast. If you want to learn more about the situation in Myanmar, you can also check out episode 8 of the CNSS podcast, where Janelle and I talk about the security, diplomatic, and regional implications of the conflict. The CNSS podcast is brought to you by the Center for National Security Studies, or CNSS. CNSS was founded in 2023 as a multidisciplinary center of excellence for the study, research, and dissemination of subjects of non traditional and traditional national security. CNSS was established as an MOU between MS Ramaya University of Applied Sciences and the Army Training Command. You can find out more about our work at cnss.msruas.ac.in.